Story 1. Amelia had always loved her old Victorian house, especially the kitchen. It was large with high ceilings and had an antique charm that made it the heart of her home. The centerpiece was a massive wooden island, worn smooth from decades of use, where she would spend hours preparing meals for her family. But lately, something about the kitchen felt off. It started with the knives. One evening, Amelia was preparing dinner when she reached for her favorite chef's knife. As soon as her hand touched the handle, she felt a sharp pain in her finger, as if the knife had cut her before she even lifted it. She looked down to see a thin crimson line across her finger. Confused, she set the knife down and wrapped her finger in a towel. The cut wasn't deep, but it stung more than it should have. Brushing it off as an accident, she continued cooking, but as she chopped vegetables, she noticed the knife felt unusually heavy in her hand, almost as if it was resisting her movements. Each slice required more effort, and she found herself struggling to control the blade. That night, as she washed the dishes, the knife slipped from her hand and narrowly missed her foot as it clattered to the floor. The sharp point stuck into the hardwood, quivering as if alive. The next morning, Amelia woke to the sound of whispering. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was there. She followed the sound down to the kitchen. The knives were out of their block, arranged in a neat row on the countertop, each blade pointing toward her. The whispering grew louder as she approached them, an unintelligible murmur that seemed to be coming from the knives themselves. Her heart pounded as she stepped back, her mind racing to find a logical explanation. Maybe she had taken them out and forgotten, but she knew that wasn't true. She hadn't touched the knives since last night. Over the next few days, the whispering continued, growing louder each time she entered the kitchen. The knives seemed to move on their own, always ending up in strange positions when her back was turned. She tried to ignore it, telling herself it was just her imagination. But the fear gnawed at her, and she started avoiding the kitchen as much as possible. One evening, Amelia's husband, Mark, noticed her distress. She finally confessed what had been happening, expecting him to laugh it off. But instead, his face grew serious. He admitted that he had heard the whispering too, late at night when he was alone in the kitchen. They both agreed that something was wrong with the house. Determined to get to the bottom of it, they decided to investigate. Mark suggested they place a camera in the kitchen to see if anything unusual happened while they slept. That night, they set up the camera and went to bed, both feeling uneasy. The next morning, they reviewed the footage. At first, everything seemed normal, but around midnight, the knives began to move. They slid across the countertop, rearranging themselves into a circle. The whispering on the audio grew louder, clearer. They could make out a single word, repeated over and over: leave. Terrified, they decided to stay with Mark's sister for a few days, hoping that whatever was happening would stop if they weren't in the house. But as they packed their bags, the whispering followed them, growing more insistent, more threatening. Desperate for answers, they visited a local historian who specialized in the history of their town. What they learned chilled them to the bone. Their house had once belonged to a man named Edgar Thorne, a butcher who was rumored to be involved in dark rituals. He had disappeared under mysterious circumstances, leaving behind only his collection of knives. According to legend, the knives were cursed, bound to the souls of those they had killed. The historian warned them that the knives would not rest until they had claimed new victims. The only way to break the curse was to destroy the knives, but doing so would be incredibly dangerous. Determined to end the nightmare, Amelia and Mark returned to the house. Armed with a hammer and a blowtorch, they approached the kitchen, ready to destroy the knives once and for all. As they entered, the whispering reached a deafening pitch, the knives vibrating on the countertop as if in anticipation. With a shout, Mark brought the hammer down on the first knife. The blade shattered, releasing a burst of cold air that sent chills down their spines. One by one, they destroyed the knives, each one releasing a scream as it broke. But as they reached the last knife, it suddenly flew into the air, spinning toward Mark with terrifying speed. Amelia screamed as the blade buried itself in his shoulder, knocking him to the ground. In a frenzy, she grabbed the knife, yanked it out, and threw it into the fireplace. The flames roared to life, consuming the blade with a bright, blinding light. For a moment, the kitchen was silent. Then, as the last remnants of the knife turned to ash, the whispering finally stopped. The curse was broken. Amelia and Mark moved out of the house soon after, unable to shake the memories of what had happened. The house was sold and the new owners never reported any strange occurrences. But Amelia would never forget the terror of those nights, the way the knives had whispered her name, urging her to leave, to flee from the darkness that had once claimed so many lives. The kitchen, once the heart of her home, had become a place of nightmares, and though the curse was broken, the memory of it would haunt her forever. Story 2. The Hunger of the Stove. Megan had always loved cooking. It was her passion, her way of expressing love. So when she and her husband Jack bought their first home together, she was thrilled to find that it came with a massive vintage stove. The realtor had called it a piece of history, a beautiful relic from the early 1900s, perfectly preserved. It was the kind of stove that would make any chef's heart skip a beat. But Megan soon discovered that this stove had a dark past, one that would consume her life. The first time Megan used the stove, it worked like a dream. She prepared a feast for her family, marveling at how evenly the oven cooked the roast, how perfectly the stovetop seared the vegetables. But as they sat down to eat, an odd feeling settled over the table. The food, though delicious, seemed to have a strange aftertaste, something metallic that Megan couldn't quite place. Jack noticed it too, but they both shrugged it off as a quirk of the old stove. Over the next few weeks, Megan cooked every meal on it, and every meal seemed to carry that same strange taste. But the more she used the stove, the more she felt an odd connection to it, as if it was somehow alive, responding to her emotions, her desires. It wasn't long before Megan started noticing strange things happening in the kitchen. Sometimes, when she wasn't looking, the stove would turn itself on, flames flickering to life as if by some unseen hand. Other times she would find the oven preheated to exactly the temperature she needed, even though she hadn't touched the dial. At first, she thought it was just her imagination, or maybe a malfunction in the old appliance. But then, things began to escalate. One evening, as she was cooking dinner, she heard a faint humming sound coming from the stove. It was low, almost imperceptible, but it made the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. When she tried to ignore it, the humming grew louder, more insistent, until it was all she could hear. Panicking, she turned off the stove, but the humming continued, vibrating through the walls, the floor, the very air around her. It only stopped when she opened the oven door, revealing the perfectly cooked dish inside. The moment she did, the humming ceased, as if the stove was satisfied. One night, Megan woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of scratching. She followed the noise to the kitchen, where she found the stove doors rattling as if something inside was trying to get out. Terrified, she grabbed a flashlight and shone it inside the oven. What she saw made her blood run cold. There, in the shadows, she saw tiny handprints, smeared in soot, across the walls of the oven. They were the size of a child's hands. Heart pounding, she slammed the door shut and backed away, unable to tear her eyes away from the stove. Desperate for answers, she began to research the history of the house and the stove. What she found was horrifying. The stove had belonged to a woman named Eliza, who had lived in the house over a century ago. Eliza had been a recluse, known in the town as a witch. According to legend, she had used the stove for dark rituals, cooking more than just food. The townspeople had suspected her of luring children into her home, never to be seen again. But it wasn't until Megan stumbled upon an old newspaper article that she learned the full truth. Eliza had indeed been responsible for the disappearance of several children, and when the townspeople finally confronted her, they found the remains of the missing children inside the stove, burned beyond recognition. The stove was cursed, they said, a vessel of unspeakable evil. Megan tried to stay away from the kitchen after that, but the stove seemed to have a hold on her. It was as if it could sense her fear, her reluctance, and it fed on it. The more she tried to avoid cooking, the more the stove demanded her attention. The humming returned louder than ever, and the kitchen grew unbearably hot, even when the stove wasn't on. Jack began to worry about her, but he couldn't see the things Megan saw. To him, the stove was just an old appliance, nothing more. But Megan knew better. She could feel the stove's hunger, a deep, insatiable need that grew stronger every day. One night, the stove's hunger became unbearable. The humming was so loud it rattled the windows, the floors. Desperate to end it, Megan ran to the kitchen and opened the stove. The moment she did, the humming stopped, replaced by a low, guttural growl that seemed to come from the very depths of the stove. Without thinking, Megan reached inside. Her hand touched something cold, metallic, and then she felt it, a sharp, searing pain as the stove slammed shut on her arm. She screamed, trying to pull away, but the stove wouldn't let go. It was as if the metal had come to life, gripping her arm with an iron vise. The pain was unbearable, and in that moment, Megan realized what the stove wanted. It wasn't food it craved, it was life. It wanted to consume her, just as it had consumed the children all those years ago. With one final desperate effort, Megan wrenched her arm free, leaving behind a piece of her flesh in the stove's jaws. She stumbled back, cradling her bleeding arm, and watched in horror as the stove seemed to pulse, to breathe, as if alive. Summoning all her strength, she grabbed a heavy skillet and smashed it against the stove. The metal dented but didn't break. The stove roared, a sound that shook the walls, and Megan knew she had to destroy it before it destroyed her. She ran to the garage, grabbed a can of gasoline, and doused the stove. As she lit the match, she hesitated, the flames reflecting in the stove's glass door. For a moment, she thought she saw a face staring back at her, twisted in pain and rage. Then with a scream, she threw the match. The kitchen erupted in flames, the stove's roar turning into a high-pitched wail. Megan watched as the fire consumed the stove, the heat driving her back. The wail grew louder, more desperate, until finally, with a deafening crack, the stove exploded, sending shards of metal flying across the room. Megan survived the fire, but the kitchen was destroyed. The house was declared uninhabitable, and she and Jack moved away, leaving the cursed stove behind in the rubble. But even now, in the quiet of the night, Megan can still hear the humming, the low, insistent sound that haunts her dreams. The stove may be gone, but its hunger remains, a dark shadow that will follow her forever.